everyone. Can you hear me okay? Yeah? We're really excited to have you joining us for this discussion about teachers who are pioneering EdTech solutions. I still remember sitting on a panel about 10 years ago. It was at Cisco, John Chambers was there, and I don't know how I got on this panel, which was my biggest question at the time, but there were a bunch of people from the medical field saying that basically, medical technology took off once doctors started pioneering the solutions. And at that point, and ever since, I've thought that's what we need in education technology is teachers who really know what the issues are and what's needed, pioneering the solutions. So we thought we would orchestrate this discussion with these teacherpreneurs, folks who were inspired by their classroom experience to pioneer different innovations with educational technology. Not only to hear their stories, but really to understand from their experience what it was that enabled them, what made it hard, so that we can all think about how do we foster more of this. And at the same time, we want to get their thoughts about the future of educational technology. So let us get started, and I'm just going to ask them to introduce themselves by explaining how their classroom experience led them to what they're doing today. Do you want to start us off?
Sure, I'll start. Hi, my name is Xiaohao Ching. I'm the founder and CEO of Literator, which started in my classroom in Oakland, California. But it's important to talk about why I ended up in the classroom in the first place, which was I had a big sense as a student going through different education systems all throughout America that there is a deep disparity and inequity in education environments based on where you live, based on your zip code, based on the color of your skin. And I knew that I wanted to shape policy or have an impact in education somehow. But I felt like just having the student experience alone wasn't enough. And I needed to go into the classroom and understand and have a deep sense of empathy for what was happening in the classroom that made it difficult for teachers as well. In my mind, I thought that would impact a trajectory for me in policy. I thought that's where you have an impact. But I happened to be teaching in Silicon Valley, in Oakland, but still in Silicon Valley, surrounded by all of these technologists who are building these tools to solve a lot of problems that didn't feel as impactful as what I was doing in my classroom, and yet I didn't have those tools. I didn't have access to that same kind of technology or those I think, like the expertise to solve for what I was trying to solve for. And so I built something. I realized, actually, building a product could be a lot faster than waiting for policy to kick in, and that the students in front of me demanded a lot of urgent, immediate action. And that was something that I was able to do if I was able to build something right away to use in my classroom. So we started Literator to help teachers with helping literacy attainment and helping them to guide that instruction of and acquisition of literacy skills for students at any level, which was the biggest problem I was facing in my classroom. And now we're in 4,500 schools and continuing to scale, and it all started because I was able to understand firsthand what the biggest, most pressing problem was for myself as a teacher, and then innovate and build on that.
And can I ask one follow-up, just to make sure we understand exactly what Literator does?
Sure, yeah. So Literator is two-pronged. Most useful is the app that actually guides teachers. The same way that you would think of Google Maps navigating for you, step by step to tell you where to turn. This is going to identify for you where students need to add behaviors or skills, where there's gaps for them in their literacy attainment, and help you identify how to have those conversations, prompt you in instructing that direct support strategically for what is appropriate for them. So it helps them on their learning journey, and it's a teacher-facing tool. So it's not a tool that a student sits down in front of a computer and starts navigating. It is something that is meant for teachers to be able to build really meaningful relationships with students in a time that is very vulnerable for them, which is their literacy development.
Great, thank you. Richard?
So my name is Richard. I will start by saying I'm going to say maths by accident a lot because I'm Australian, and I try to say math when I'm here and then I forget. But so I am the co-founder of an organization called Maths Pathway. We're an Australian group, and someone used this term for me the other day, I'm a reformed management consultant. So I was a management consultant before becoming a teacher, and I was driven into teaching simply by the fact that it felt like the most impactful profession I could choose. I'd kind of gotten bored of solving corporate problems, and I thought, let's solve some kind of interesting human student-related problems. And I have this really clear memory of the first time I walked into class. We'd had the first few days of professional development and planning and prep work in the school, and I walked into class and I taught 7th grade math, and they said, here's the course, here's the structure, here's the textbook, go. And I went, yeah, okay, that seems reasonable. And then about 30 seconds later, I discovered that all of my 7th graders were not all on page 1 of the textbook. They had come from a whole variety of backgrounds. They'd come from a whole mix of kind of skills and capacities. I had 12-year-olds who couldn't count, literally sitting next to 12-year-olds who could solve quadratic equations. And so I, struggled onwards for the next kind of 3.5 years of teaching. But all the while, what was kind of bothering me was that there was something actually fundamentally wrong with the situation. It wasn't, the kids were not the problem, that other teaching staff were not the problem, not even the school and its structure was the problem. But actually, the kind of realization for me came when I realized that it's not that we designed an education system, and it works this way in most of the Western world and in large chunks of the East as well, that treats students as, you can kind of treat them as a one-size-fits-all mold. Right? You have a set of students, they're in a particular grade, you take them through the same course, the same curriculum, the same materials, and you maybe have like an easy, medium, and hard version. And as teachers, we try really hard to differentiate, to use personalized learning. But when you're constrained by that system that says you have to teach the same thing to the same group of kids in pursuit of the same standard, you just incentivize all the wrong behaviors from schools and teachers and students. And so as a kind of a natural, so I grew up in South Africa, and I learned there both the value of education and also a certain disregard for rules. And so what I started with my co-founder largely by accident was a way of adapting really the core maths approach and curriculum to the needs of our students with the very simple premise that what if we could just teach the math that any given kid needed to them at that point in a way that made sense for them, and forget about how old they were or what class they were in. And that turns out to be really hard. And so we've spent the last sort of 6 years building actually a learning and teaching model. It started off as a tech tool, and it was this really interesting realization we had after a few years that, hey, guess what? I mean, any teacher should have told me this. If you build a tool and you give it to a teacher and you expect to change behavior from students, you're not going to get that consistently or reliably. You've just given them another tool to use. And so what we've actually designed then is the next stage of a learning and teaching model for mathematics that throws away the concept of one size fits all and turns it into, and we have a web platform, we have an app, we have a set of different things, but we also have a bunch of instructional model design that sits behind that. So to us, we actually don't like the label EdTech at all because it comes with so many sort of components of, oh, you're a supplementary tool that you throw into the classroom in the hope that it will work. And we're very much against that mode of kind of intervening in education.
And can you quickly say a little bit about, scale and impact of what you've built?
Yeah, sure. So we're Australian only at this point. We have about 70,000 students in about 250 schools who have basically switched from however they were teaching mathematics before to this new model. And we get on average 2.5 times the outcomes in maths as the traditional teaching model. So regardless of socioeconomic status, gender, or kind of sector, so our kind of top-end private schools and regional schools all achieve equivalently equitable results, which we measure in kind of growth, right? So we say if a student was making years worth of progress, now they're making 2.5 years in the same time.
Awesome. Thank you. Kim.
I'm still not used to talk in front of a lot of people, even if I was a teacher. I'm Kim. It's spelled Quim, but it's Kim. I'm from Barcelona, where I got the charming accent. I was a maths teacher in middle and high school, and myself, I go to YouTube from time to time to learn something new. Like the other day I learned how to iron my shirt because I was too embarrassed to call my mom. And that happens like more than 80% of the students in any class will go to YouTube to look for help for their homework. But I don't know if you know, but YouTube is an entertaining company. So you start by trying to learn something and you end up watching NBA videos and Baby Shark videos at 2 a.m. in the morning randomly because the algorithm tells you so. So as a teacher, I found that video was a very powerful tool, and that's no surprise. Like Khan Academy is in this conference, and I would love to meet him because he was such an inspiration for me. This idea that students can watch the video as many times as they want, self-paced, differentiating the instruction. Those are like wonderful words that any teacher wants to hear. And as a teacher, I said like, okay, let's record my own videos because I cannot find on YouTube like the right video for me. Like there are trillions of videos. It's very hard to find maths in Catalan or Spanish, what is the language I speak. So I reinvented the wheel. I created 300 videos. I shared them with my students, and I was expecting them to watch them and learn from those videos. And surprise, they didn't watch the videos, or if they were watching the videos, I wasn't getting any data if they were understanding the lessons. So I realized as a teacher, and that's the most uncomfortable situation that you can have as a teacher, that you prepare like the whole lesson for that day based on the premise that they will watch the videos, and they haven't. So like you have no plan. And as a teacher, you will 100% agree with me that if you don't have a plan for your students, the students have a plan for you. And I realized that there was no platform to manage my videos. And I was lucky enough to have 3 co-founders. So you were asking, Wendy, like, we have to empower more teachers. Teachers alone, it's very difficult to build an idea or a company or a business eventually. In my case, like, 3 of my best friends are engineers. I know them since we were 3 years old, so you can say it's kind of destiny. And they helped me build what is Edpuzzle today, which is a platform where teachers can pick any video from YouTube, or they can upload their own videos, and they can embed questions that go along with the video, so that when they share those lessons with the students watch them at their own pace. The question pops up, they have to respond, or they have to watch the video if they didn't quite get it. And the teacher gets all that information on who's watching the video and who's not, and who's understanding the lessons through the questions or not. And by providing these easy-to-use tools and very powerful tools to teachers, they are curating the best content available online, and they are putting a little bit of work, a few questions, so that those video lessons become more useful for another teacher to reuse. Plus, we have all the data from the students watching those videos, so we can quickly identify which videos are actually having more impact or not. So now teachers, instead of going to YouTube to search something, they go to our platform to find the next lesson. We started 5 years ago. Literally, I was closing the door of my classroom and we started coding. And today we have a little bit more than 87,000 schools around the world, more than 25 million students, and more than 5 million video lessons. And we grow almost like a Khan Academy each day in terms of video lessons curated by our users. And it's a fantastic experience to be able to understand the challenge that I had as a teacher and be able to help so many teachers in different areas, countries, to use videos more effectively.
Cool. Thanks, Mary.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Miriam Altman, and I'm co-founder and CEO of Kinvolved. We are a New York City-based company. We're a for-profit benefit corporation. And we started in 2012. Shortly thereafter, a couple years thereafter, we won the Teach for America Social Innovation Awards, so we can talk a little bit more about that. But before that, I got my career started in 2008 as an educator through Teach for America in a high school in New York City. And from almost the first day in the classroom, literally within the first week, I was just stunned to see how many kids were missing my class, either a specific class period or really late to school, or just missing the entire school day, consecutive days, and so on. And of course, if kids aren't showing up to school, there's very little that you can do as an educator, regardless of how hard you try, to make sure that they're progressing towards, in my specific class, passing an exam that was required for graduation in New York City public schools, but ultimately, progressing towards graduation from high school, as well as moving on to bigger and better things throughout their lives. And so I was really confounded by this challenge, and didn't really understand exactly why, first of all, my school administration was accepting this as really a status quo issue. I heard things like, from teachers I really respected and who were really training me along the way, that if kids don't show up to school, you just have to kind of move on, especially in a history classroom, which is the course that I taught. You have a very intense volume of content you have to get through, and if kids miss it, you just have to kind of keep moving on. And I thought there was something really inherently wrong with that kind of a response. When we're seeing kids at the volume we were, in my class it could have been 50% of students, which was not unusual across my entire school, who were missing class every single day. So I was wondering what was going on, sort of what the problem was, or what the causes behind this challenge were, or the reasons behind it. And what I started to do was to actually meet parents at parent-teacher night, especially that first year that I was teaching. And previous to parent-teacher night, I've been hearing from a lot of my, again, colleagues whom I really respected that, you're not going to be able to get a hold of parents, they're not going to be effective, they're not going to be helpful in making sure that kids are coming to school, much less anything else. They just unfortunately don't care about education, which again, I thought was particularly problematic as a response to families of the students we were serving. So when I started meeting parents at parent-teacher night, I realized that was not at all true, and a lot of the suspicions were debunked. It was most often that parents either didn't speak English as a native language, so communicating via robocall, which is sort of the status quo in the school, if a kid missed school, wasn't going to work for families, especially if it was in English. Second of all, families change their phone numbers all the time in the communities that we tend to serve most. And then third, that nobody answers a robocall. Think about the number of robocalls you've probably gotten today or this week. I certainly can speak to this myself. I just look at a number. If I don't recognize it, I'm going to ignore it. And so people aren't even getting the messages at the end of the day. It's not that parents don't want to be engaged. So I started to save parents' numbers on my phone, and thankfully I speak enough Spanish to kind of get by with the families of students who spoke Spanish as a native language, and saw almost immediate results for most of my students when I was able to have that direct touch point with families. And most of the time I would just text message them from my own phone because that's what I had. And so fast forward a couple years later, after trying a variety of different sort of interventions in my classroom, went on to co-found Kinvolved with my co-founder Alex Meese in 2012, whom I met at the Wagner School. We were studying policy at NYU, and developed Kinvolved, which is a solution to chronic absenteeism by better engaging families in education. And tactically what that actually looks like is that we've built an app called Kinvolved, that's our primary product, that directly integrates with the school districts or the school student information system, which is the system of record where teachers have to input attendance data to begin with. And then we automate the communication between school and home around attendance information as a starting point in more than 80 different languages. And the engagement is two-way. So parent will get a text message, they can text right back, it'll go back to the main point of contact of the school, who you might think of as the person in the main office making phone calls traditionally. Now they're able to text message with parents. And it cuts down on average about 5 hours per week of this person's time. In addition, teachers can use it to communicate about anything that's happening with a student, from individual student progress to even administrators communicating with school letter reminders, to now districts. We have a district in Georgia, for example, that just communicated with families during Hurricane Michael about the protocol around the emergency alerts of what to do as that hurricane was coming to shore. So it's really broadened out beyond just attendance. We know family engagement can have a lot of really positive results. And I would just say the last thing is to sort of accompany the software, because having been in the classroom, I think we probably all would agree to some degree that just building a beautiful app for teachers isn't going to solve such a deeply entrenched problem as absenteeism or low family involvement. So we've built some really thoughtful coaching that goes alongside that to ensure that people really understand how to use it so that they'll see the impact results that we've continued to see year over year.
Mm-hmm. And say a bit about where you all are and the impact you're seeing too.
Sure. So we started off really focusing in on New York City schools for the first several years, really. And so we've gotten to about 150 New York City schools. But in the last 2 years, 2.5, we've broadened out to work in about 10 states, about 15 school districts, and we work at the enterprise level most frequently. So when I say district, I mean we've got like the whole district on board and district leadership sort of centrally on board. And part of the reason for that, despite the challenges that are real about enterprise sales, is that we're not going to see the kind of community level or community-wide impact that we really need if disparate teachers here and there are using our product or kind of engaging in this mission. So most recently, our 2018 impact report that we put out in January reported a number of case studies, but one of the things that we saw was in a particular district in Meriden, Connecticut, 10% decrease in chronic absence, which are those kids who are most at risk due to absenteeism compared with the previous school year. We also saw that school and home exchanged almost 10 million messages last year, and this year they're on track to exchange about 25 million messages. And so for us, we think of that as a thread communication that may not have happened before the Kinvolved software was enabled within this district. And a lot of that engagement is really, really positive as well, and that's where some of the coaching comes in, because you have to have that positive foundation and the positive relationship first before you even start communicating about a kid missing a day or a period here and there. You can't have the parent be part of the solution if they don't feel like it's coming from a trusting place with real rapport.
Awesome. I just love hearing your examples. I mean, such practical solutions that are working and scaling. It's incredible. I want to shift gears for a second and then come back to you all's kind of experiences as educational entrepreneurs. But I'm curious what you think about kind of the state of EdTech, although I hear your meaning. So I was talking not long ago with the founders of one of the very big incubators, awesome people, who basically shared that 10 years ago when they launched, they thought, they had had lots of other entrepreneurial experiences that had moved mountains, and they said, let's take on learning outcomes. We're gonna see a sea change in learning outcomes, and we're gonna do it through educational technology. And their reflection is, we've done a lot of cool things, but we haven't seen the sea change in learning outcomes. And I guess I just wonder what your overall kind of reflection is about, what's the future? I mean, what do you see? Do you feel like we're leaving a lot on the table in terms of how we could be leveraging technology to improve education? Where's the energy going that it shouldn't be going? I mean, just what's your take about the state of affairs in this sector?
I can say something. Well, I think that there's one thing that brought me into the edtech space in the first place was I felt like there was a huge disconnect between the state of education, especially with edtech, right? There's tech, there's edtech, and then there's education. And they all seem to operate in these very specific mindsets. Educators coming from a place of wanting to serve students, caring a lot deeply about educational outcomes. And then edtech, by its nature, caring a lot about, impact, because that's a part of the wanting to have that space, but about profits, right? And how we figure out how to build a real marketplace for innovative solutions is the big question in edtech. And I think the future of edtech has a lot to do with how we figure out how to deal with the marketplace as it is. The challenges that startups now have with selling into districts or scaling through enterprise sales, right? There has to be other models, and it has to do a lot with collaboration. I think the thing that has to change is the idea that not just that educators are more so a part of EdTech, but that districts and school leaders and education innovators are all in the same conversation from the beginning in a really intentional way. Because I think there are a lot of excuses. There are a lot of excuses as to why we have what we have as the leading EdTech companies. And I think it's not necessarily, it can't stay the way that it is.
I mean, so we were even just talking this morning, one of the excuses we often hear, and we were told this when we started, is that schools are too complicated. You can't build a thing and then sell it or market it or partner with the school in any kind of real way, because they're not like other companies, and their school districts are really complicated and buying processes are hard. And so, from our point of view, there was this. I mean, so we interestingly attempted to partner in the early years with a couple of other EdTech firms in the maths kind of division and the work they were doing, because we saw some real, to use a consulting-y word, synergies with how they worked. And it was the number of times we got told, oh, no, schools are not ready for that level of change. They're not interested in actually making anything be different. You'll only be able to sell them something supplementary. I got told that like twice this morning at this conference. Is that, if you're going to come to the US, don't bother with core. Just supplementary, sell something. It's a huge market. If you only have a few percent of it, that's fine. You'll make a lot of money. Okay, but that's not why I get out of bed in the morning, right? And so I think there's this whole narrative around schools being just like such an overcomplicated place. And I think it's a framing thing then. So if you want to change outcomes, if you want to see change in outcomes, you need more than just user numbers. Our entire change theory is that if you want a change in outcomes, you need to change behaviors. Well, actually, technically, you either need to change the environment or the behaviors. Now, generally, we can't. So that's the thing we accept. We say, we'll take a school or a system as it is, and we won't try and change its environment. We won't try and say, well, let's change the nature of the students at that school, because we don't normally have that control. The students are the students at that school. And so you have to change the behaviors of the teachers and the leaders and the district kind of decision makers and the students in a classroom. And suddenly you can't just do that on the other end of a Wi-Fi connection. And I think that's where there's a framing issue as well.
Yeah, I was just on a panel on the East Coast with one of our investors, who is in the back there actually, a social impact investor, another like a more venture capital investor that's at this conference as well, and then one of our district partners. And the district partner, I think the moderator asked a question about like what does it take, district partner, to really see impact and change? And he said, I'm so like thrilled to be part of this conversation, and really like this has been a learning experience for me, just being on the panel and seeing sort of the full ecosystem of how ed tech businesses operate. Like he sees it from his particular perspective, which is extremely powerful. He has the purchasing power, but I think to really understand what school systems need, and also to come to them with a perspective that is really supporting rather than kind of trying to push something down or force something in. You have to make them part of the conversation at all levels and really welcome them in and try to get their feedback and their support. And I think there's a lot of different ways to do that, but I think oftentimes the business of EdTech and the like customers that we're serving and the end users that we're trying to engage and create impact for are completely disparate. The second thing that I would say is that I think to really see change in the future, back to your initial question, Wendy, we really have to take on these issues from a systemic perspective. So as I mentioned, Kinvolved looks at this from a community-wide lens. We've chosen the enterprise sales route, which isn't always the easiest, but you really have to kind of get at all of the different pieces that come together to ensure that there's success for students and there's capacity there. But it's really hard to do that alone, and it's also hard to do it with the district and by yourself. So I think what Michelle was saying about starting to see more ed tech companies partnering with one another, that can be really powerful instead of trying to like operate in these silos and compete with each other so much. I mean, the market is super fragmented, and it's just incredibly hard to make a huge dent. So it's sort of from a market perspective, is it better to have a bigger piece of like something really small, or a smaller piece as a founder or a business owner of something that's big and that has huge impact and that's really reaching a huge number of students, families, and educators. And to me, the second is much more compelling. When I think of more broadly how I personally want to have an impact on the world and the education system.
I could talk for hours about this because it's such a broad question, but I will focus on something Miriam said before. You said that you can build something beautiful and easy to use for teachers, but that doesn't mean you're going to change the classroom, and I couldn't agree more with that. I think technology or EdTech amplifies the outcomes of your classroom, either positive or negative. Like, just because you put technology doesn't mean the students are actually going to pay attention or learn. That's something people still do not understand. So it can amplify your students because they are distracted and going to Facebook and Twitter and not paying attention to your class and wasting their time. Or you can actually have like an amazing impact on your students by using these tools. So I think EdTech, it depends on how we approach it. It can have huge impact closing the gap into the access of learning in general. That doesn't mean like, again, it's not about sending computers to every single school in the world or something like that. I mean, that's fantastic to have that access, but that's not enough. So it has the possibility to close the gaps. For example, in our platform, we have amazing teachers curating or uploading their own videos. And I wish I had those amazing chemistry teachers have an impact, not only in their limited classroom, but in classrooms around the world. And that's possible through technology. The challenge is that it can definitely close that gap, but it can also increase it because maybe the schools do not have access to that technology, or the students do not have access to internet at home, or the school or the district do not believe in EdTech, or they don't want to invest in these companies. And we have probably all seen this. It's hard to have conversations as companies with people that do not see this. We respect it because they obviously have other things to do, but it's also like not deciding to invest in EdTech is also a decision you are making for your kids. Like, I would tell them, like, do you understand your kids would die without YouTube? Do you understand they will, like when they finish school, if they want to learn something, if they don't have a tutor at home, if they don't have money to pay for extracurricular activities, they will spend their days on YouTube, and that's the only way you can actually learn something different. And for continuous learning, that YouTube is their best chance they have. And they're like, oh, well, we blog YouTube. And it's very hard to have a conversation. So I don't know the future of EdTech. It's just like it can have like a huge impact in both ways of the spectrum. Like it can have like close the gap and give access to millions of people to amazing resources.
Can I add something on that note?
Yeah.
Do you mind? I think that, when we're talking about EdTech, and this is one of the other reasons that I feel very committed to this space, is it's very easy for this to turn into not something that is inclusive and accessible, but actually perpetuates privilege, right? If we aren't thoughtful about what we're building and what is able to scale and what is funded, then what happens, right? Are we then left with a bunch of consumer-facing technologies that only rich parents can buy for their students? And I think that's one of the things that I think a lot, and want to say very explicitly about the future of EdTech, is if we leave it up to, let's say, venture capitalists or the market to define what EdTech is, that will turn into a very different thing than what I think people who have come from the classroom or have a deep empathy and understand that building product can be an extension, or that design can be an extension of empathy, that EdTech can actually be something that is in service of education and innovation. But I think if we leave it to, again, the marketplace to define what EdTech is, it's going to change. The definition is, for you to say that we don't even want to call ourselves EdTech. So at this point, if you talk to somebody who's investing in EdTech, what are they really saying, right? Are they talking about like AI for, I don't know, like lunches? I don't know, just making something up. Like you have to be really specific about your intentions. And I think that was, one of my feelings and the charge that I feel a sense of in this space, if we're shaping the future of EdTech, is to be, again, very explicit, very intentional about who's setting the standard for what EdTech is and how we're figuring out that it's sustainable. And if we are relying on the traditional marketplaces to make that happen, it's not going to be sustainable in favor of students.
So it feels like you all's perspective, having been a teacher, having worked in the system, having gotten to know kids and families, has influenced more than even your idea. Like you thought of the idea because of your experience, but also sort of every choice you've made along the way. I mean, that's what I'm hearing from you all. And it makes me want to know more about, what enabled you to do what you're doing. I mean, one of you said, but it took, I had to work with engineers and with, maybe we don't have everything, but we bring a certain part. I'm just curious how your experience as kind of education entrepreneurs has gone. What enabled it? And what do you think makes it hard for other educators to kind of bring their full skills into this realm as well?
So I have kind of, my main answer to that question is luck, in our case, in terms of what enabled it. So, I mean, I think we were not the first teachers, we're not the first maths teachers to spot exactly the same problem we spotted. We were not the first people to complain about the same problem. We had the great fortune of so I didn't really know my co-founder. We actually met accidentally at a Teach for Australia conference. I had done a bunch of years of work. So this was kind of one of my early bugbears. I'd done a bunch of years of work as a management consultant, and therefore I worked a lot of hours and earned a lot of money and didn't have any time to spend it because I had no time to have fun. So I had a lot of cash sitting in a bank account, which enabled me to join teaching, but also enabled me to stop teaching and for the two of us to not have salaries for 2 years. That's not design or cleverness, that's pure luck. And one of the things that was really interesting is when I talked to other kind of, what do we call them, teacherpreneurs, is that they say, how did you get your initial fund? How did you get the first, not the 900K, I was sitting in some investor stuff before, right? Seed rounds, 900K, million, people are getting 2 million. That's fine, there's a market for this stuff. But how did you get your first 50? How did you spend the first year? And we said, 18 months, 2 people, no salaries. Well, I mean, just because we happened to have some cash and we, kind of did things on a shoestring. So I think that's a reality. As you're a teacher, you've got a full-time job. Do you have the luxury of not having a full-time job for a while while you build something else? I think is helpful. But I also think the thing that's really interesting to me is if you want to actively include more educators in the world of EdTech, I think one of the things you look for is risk tolerance, as in an outsized acceptance of risk. Because I think most entrepreneurs are yes, I'll do crazy, stupid things, and maybe they'll work. And there are teachers like that, and it's not every teacher has that kind of characteristic. But I actually think if you're going to kind of recruit for that, in a sense, you look for people who will accept and enjoy risk, and a lot of teachers actually are built like that. May never consider themselves as possible entrepreneurs, though. And I think that's a kind of a thing we could, I don't know whether that's an in-service thing or whether we do that in our recruitment or training, but I think if we give teachers more examples of, well, actually, here's other things you can do, and I don't know how this conversation plays out in the US, but in Australia, if you're a teacher and then you go outside of teaching, you're often a bit less, right? Teaching is the profession, it's the calling, it's the greatness. And then we kind of have the societal thing of if you leave the classroom, even to work on greater scaled impact in education, but you're not a teacher anymore. So I think that's an interesting, and as I said, I don't know how that plays out elsewhere, but it's an interesting.
Interesting. That's a good problem to have.
Yeah.
For most countries. What would the rest of you say to this in terms of what enabled you and what do you think holds some folks back?
Well, I think somebody else mentioned this too. You can't do this alone, right? And I happened to be in Silicon Valley. Sure, I think that was really helpful. I was surrounded by people who had the skill sets to build this, but that doesn't mean you could automatically walk into a room and just recruit, right? And that also wasn't my intention. I don't think that when I first started Literator, I wanted a solution for my classroom. I wanted to make sure my kids could read. That was ultimately my goal, and if we had finished a product that I could use, that would be awesome. But it wasn't really until so the way that I even pitched Literator in the first place was at an event called Startup Weekend EDU, which brought together like engineers and designers, and I was like, great, this is where I'm gonna meet the people who can build that thing I need. But it wasn't until I had my first meeting with the team that eventually won the competition. We had this conversation, and the guy that could have been my CTO said, like, listen, I know we're supposed to care about like equity or whatever. And my jaw dropped. I'm like, here's this engineer who came to this event because he cares about education, but now he's putting equity in air quotes. I'm like, this is not gonna fly. If this is what happens at this table, then what's happening in all these other rooms where people aren't even talking about education as being a problem that we need to solve for. And so it actually helped me become, really clear on the fact that like, if I was going to do this, and I should do this, because if I care about this problem and I wanna sit at these tables where these decisions are being made, then I can vocalize these things. But I also realized the people who would help me get there also had to care about that. And so when I went to find my co-founders, I eventually met a woman who had left Apple and was a designer and an engineer. She was like a unicorn in this field, and had worked to build Safari, so had this amazing insight into like really beautiful user design, and happened to say and lead with, I'm really trying to think about social impact in whatever I do next. I care a lot about what I'm going to do, and I was like, my person. She's never going to work with me, but maybe she'll be able to help me. She eventually did join, and we've been working together for the last 4 years, but it's really, I think, having that intention and also having a really deliberate story around why it was that I wanted to build Literator. At that point, it wasn't even just about building a tool for my classroom. It was about making sure that equity was like the centerpiece of why we're innovating in education. And being able to lead with that when I'm talking to this like really talented engineer who did have the resources to like take a huge pay cut and not get market rate for a long time. That was the thing. It was my story was my currency. And I also think it's important to note that like when I first started, I talked to a lot of other edtech founders and I asked them how they started. And some people went through like Imagine K12 or YC. But some people were like, oh yeah, I have a trust fund. And I'm like, okay, well I am in the classroom serving the same kids that I grew up with, right? I am here because I care about education. I'm not coming from that background. So I will say, I also won the Teach for America Social Innovation Award, which was one of the only things that made it possible for me to consider going full time. So I'm very grateful for that.
Yeah, I was going to echo a little bit of what you both brought up already, which is, first of all, I mean, there's definitely an element of luck to some degree. I think just being in the right place at the right time, like meeting the right people. I think being part of a network like Teach for America or Teach for All, or there are a couple of others as well, where this is kind of part of the DNA of how, like, when you're learning to teach, you're also learning to think about innovation, either within your own classroom or potentially taking that outside. So it's an idea that's sort of like initiated early, and it doesn't seem out of reach. I think for a lot of the teachers I taught with, and I taught in a school that I was the only TFA core member, which was actually awesome. I think I know a lot of those people are just as entrepreneurial as I am, but I don't know if they saw themselves as entrepreneurs, or saw themselves as having the ability to kind of step out of a job with a certain salary and going and taking these risks that we've all taken. So one of the things that I always tell people, whether it's in education and you're interested in entrepreneurship or innovation, or in other fields generally, is that before you kind of think about starting something new, think about how we can better utilize the resources that are already available. And I think that has a couple of benefits. One, that school systems are already spending a lot of money on products that they're sort of using maybe a little bit. And if we were to employ more educators who really could help transform those products that are already, have access to the purse strings of school districts, perhaps they would have a much stronger impact. So that's one thing that would make it more beneficial. secondly, for teachers who may feel like it's too much of a risk to go out and start your own thing, having the sort of the stability of working within an existing initiative or company or organization that already has raised funding, you're not responsible for that, but you have the sort of like flexibility to really innovate and inform how a product or execution or implementation goes. And for those companies and organizations to really truly be receptive to teachers' perspective, having been on the ground, I think that there's a real opportunity there that we're sort of taking advantage of, but not really fully in this industry. So I think, I think that those are some, core ways that we could really bring teachers in more.
In my case, I think the advantage of being a teacher in the classroom, one, you can manage uncertainty, and I think that's important when you run a startup, because kids, like, you never know. But especially because you can connect at a personal level with the challenges that we have in education. I think that drives entrepreneurs in any sector, I think. Like, I think if you have a pain or you have experienced something that you don't like or you hate or that has been painful, that's a huge driver for you to keep pushing. I think that's one of the things that you connect with the reality of the problem, and you remember that. Like in my case, it was names of kids. Like, how more real is that? And also, I think this very millennial approach, I guess, that then you dream like, oh, I can have, like, it's not a lack of ideas. Like, teachers have ideas on how to change their classroom. They're actually reinventing their class every single summer. So it's not a lack of ideas. We have ideas and we have this vision that we can build something or a product that will help our kids. So the ideas are there. Those are the two things I think as a teacher you can get from the experience in the classroom. Now, it's how having an idea is not enough. You need luck, a lot of it. But I think it's how you learning the skills and the steps to turn an idea into a product, then a product into a company, then a company into a business, and then a business reaching your vision. I think all these little steps, or big steps, is what in our case was going through an incubator that helped us a lot, because I didn't have that experience as a teacher. Like, I understood the problem. I had a clear vision and idea, but we didn't know how, like, what to do. So I think that's where we can help teachers really turn these ideas and these problems into actual solution, products, companies, businesses, and make it happen.
Sorry, can I just to expand on that and connect with Miriam's point? I actually really like this idea that maybe the other thing we do too much of then is saying to teachers, oh, come up with an idea. So I'm not entirely disagreeing with your point, but come up with an idea, come to an incubator, turn your idea into a business. I actually think there's quite a lot of value of come up with an idea, see what else there is, integrate into that, right? Join that firm, that company, go there and pitch your idea to these guys and have them expand what they're already doing in schools to something else. I actually think that's phenomenal because we have this massively fragmented, like everyone's trying to sell everything to schools, and it just seems to get more and more niche, right? As you get bigger players doing the big things, you get more people doing tinier and tinier things, right? You get to start really specific, tech-specific, it's like, well, we actually only do, grade 1 literacy on this particular type of tablet for that segment, right? And it's because everyone's chasing their market, but possibly part of that is the message that we send as an EdTech community saying, that's what we expect you to do. Because we didn't go through any incubators, there aren't that many in Australia, but I wonder what message we're telling people in them today. It's like, yes, do the market segmentation, do the slicing, do the thing, end up here, here's your niche, here's your product, go. Which I don't think serves our broader outcomes.
Yeah, let's very quickly, like back to the future of EdTech question that you asked earlier, Wendy. I think this ties in very nicely to where I see it going, which is there are so many different products and so many ways to attack different problems, and there are so many niche kind of companies that are targeting different markets out there. And I think there's such an opportunity, as I alluded to a little bit before, to really partner and pull together and kind of push individual egos out of the way, which is, I think, related to what you're saying. Like, you don't have to be the founder of a company. That can be great and that can be really challenging. But there are so many things that exist out there today that we could potentially, the collaborations take a lot of different forms. You could fully merge your companies, you could be acquired, you could partner with marketing, you could integrate your products so it's easier for school systems to access. But really just being more open-minded to that and not so concerned about our own personal or organizational or funders' benefits and thinking about the benefit of the end user and sort of what this could do for the entire industry, I think is where we need to go.
So how do we do all of this? I mean, it feels like there's so much more energy in this space than there was, say, 10 years ago, from my perspective at least, which is a great thing. But you all are all speaking to some pretty significant ways that it's not quite working to get to the transformational outcomes that we all want to see. So if you could wave a magic wand and say, like, here's the thing I would do to foster the kind of, you're speaking about collective leadership, basically, like how do we get the educators, the technologists, the venture capitalists, the districts, like how do we somehow have a more holistic approach? I don't know, how do you really do this? Like if you had, like, here's the lever, here's what I would do differently if I was in charge of the whole system.
I think one of the things when we're talking about sort of behavioral change management is like, that's one of the 4 tenets of our impact report was sort of like, our impact report this year is a roadmap to improving attendance. How do you do this? Here are some of the results. Our first number 1 of the 4 is change management, and we think about that with our professional development with districts. How do we get everyone on board to really like embrace attendance improvement as an initiative, embrace that there's a challenge here and there's a partner who's here to help us. But I think we also need to really apply that to this industry. We need to think about everyone and had mutual respect for everyone who's part of this work. And like I said, with this panel that we had on Friday, bringing district leaders in shouldn't be an anomaly. That should be something that we're doing all the time, as well as teachers, and not in like our own different little conferences here and there. I think we need to really figure out a way to trust that each of us have expertise in different areas of the sort of funnel, and it's really a collective impact opportunity. And people have different areas that they're experts in, but everyone has an expertise and something to offer. And we can really draw from that to see real systemic change.
In my opinion, it's on giving, changing the image that we have of teachers. This is a classic idea, like nothing new. But when I visit many schools, and I came across like a few teachers that decided to stop teaching for a couple of years to go to work for Apple. And I was like, that's amazing. Like having this idea that teacher has to be in the classroom for many years, have the same impact, same student, well, the students change, but same curriculum and not having any skills or learning outside of their classroom, it's very tough for any human being. So I think changing that image of the teacher and giving them the possibility to jump to other positions and learn different skills and have an open mind and understanding that they can develop themselves into a professional that could have an impact outside of their classroom. I think that would be fantastic. If I could do that, that would be amazing. Like if teachers could work for a couple of years, have an amazing impact, go work for a company for a couple more, then work on administration for a couple more years, come back to the classroom, and now you come with new ideas and new impact. Work for a couple of years and have this, I think that kind of healthy ecosystem inside and outside of the classroom for so many teachers. Like I have talked to so many teachers saying like, I need social engagement or self-esteem or this kind of support that they're not just going to babysit kids for a week, and seeing teachers as they have certain abilities and skills that they can be applied to other sectors. That would be fantastic, because for EdTech, you need so many other skills. It's very difficult for a teacher not only to have the skills to develop their ideas, but as well the vision to see outside of their classroom and see way more where they can have the impact. So I think if I could do that, obviously there are many other things that can be done and have to be done, but I think that would be fantastic.
Interesting.
Sorry.
I just have I think my impression on is very opposite of that, in that I think that there are so many brilliant teachers who especially in America, right, are undervalued for the work that they do and should be in the classroom but supported in that as much as possible, and making that a much better experience for them. If I could wave a magic wand, first thing I would do is change that. I would make sure that teachers were paid exponentially more than they are. I think making that really sustainable is one thing. But on the flip side, I think there's this sense of, again, talking about the future of EdTech and what it can look like collaboratively, right? There has to be a recalibration of expectations. I think there's a sense that we must meet the same kind of demands that every other space has with EdTech as a marketplace. And that's an aside. I think that's one thing. I would get rid of that, and I would figure out what long-term investment in innovative education solutions looks like. I would figure out how to make that sustainable both for funders, but also for the companies that are trying to be really thoughtful in assessing whether what they're building is actually impactful, which takes time. Because kids don't learn and then immediately change overnight, right? And we don't see outcomes in a day or a week or a year. It takes a long time. So I think having this sense that the education space is very unique, and we're dealing with factors that are not just numbers, right? Not just scale, not just saturation of a market, but actual outcomes and thoughtful collaboration. And I think that really practically this is happening. There's a fund that's starting in the Midwest actually that has created an incubator that is partnering directly with the school district as they're incubating ideas for the education technology that they're trying to build. And that's something that they decided from the very beginning, just intuitively. And I think, again, I don't think every teacher should rush to start an edtech business, but everybody has a way in which we can collaborate to make this a better space for our students.
So I would say there is now, I'll preface this, I've discovered in the last 2 days that sometimes things that I think are not controversial are controversial in this country. So I don't know if this will be. But I would, if I could raise my wand, I would do an incentive aligning exercise where every investor in every ed tech or education company added one element to their list of requirements. One thing that they require all of their the companies in which they invest to do, and that would be to do something that is similar to, and there are many terms for this, but I'll use the one I know, similar to an implementation science approach. So I read a book that was published here in the US a few years ago. It's called Learning to Improve. Again, I don't know if it's controversial, but I think it's amazing. And it talks exactly about, it's a recipe for how you develop and measure long-term change in complex systems. And it doesn't tell you what to fix about the system. It says, here's how we should approach fixing a complex system. We take all the learnings we had in health, which is the one that did this most recently and incredibly successfully, and not without controversy. There were some doctors and nurses who got very upset by some of the changes that were made, but it was done with patient outcomes in mind. And patient outcomes in the last 10 years have improved out of sight. And not because we built apps for doctors.
Yeah.
Because we did complex change in the system of medicine, some of which involve technology. I think if you're investing, so we do this work, and I have to kind of convince our investors it's a good idea. If they required it of us and of everyone else they invested in, then you immediately get that we're talking about a long-term system change output, and that's part of the metrics that we're measuring our return on.
Yeah. Beautiful. You all have given us so much to think about how we can reshape the system to foster more incredibly thoughtful entrepreneurship like you're pursuing. So thank you so much. And please.
Thank you.